The healer's candle flickered as she lowered the glass vial and whispered, "You've hidden your voice for too long, girl." The words lingered like a curse as Alma slipped out into the storm. Rain plastered her dark cloak to her skin. Now, at 20, she had become what she pretended to be, invisible. The servants called her mute Alma. But then the great bronze bell tolled through the corridors, 3 deep, echoing strikes. Every servant froze. And on the throne of blackened bone and gold sat King Drogo Hugh, the ruler of the 5 kingdoms. The immortal monarch whispered about in every corner of the realm. His gaze swept across the crowd and stopped. Right on her. Alma froze. 7 years of silence ends tonight. Before we go further, make sure you subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what happens next might just make you question how far you'd go to survive. Now, let's get back to the story. The healer's candle flickered as she lowered the glass vial and whispered, "You've hidden your voice for too long, girl," the healer murmured. But a voice that powerful was never meant to stay buried. Alma didn't believe her. Not yet. But some truths can't stay silent forever. Alma Stoke sat on the edge of the wooden table, hands folded neatly in her lap to hide their trembling. The old healer peered into her throat with wrinkled fingers and weary eyes. "There's nothing wrong with your voice, child," the woman murmured. "The muteness, it's a choice, isn't it?" Alma's pulse quickened. Her fingers clenched around her skirt. She shook her head small, frantic movements, and pointed to her throat as if to say, "It hurts. It doesn't work. Please don't ask again." The healer sighed softly, stepping back. 7 years, she whispered, half to herself. "Whatever you're hiding from, girl, silence can only protect you for so long." The words lingered like a curse as Alma slipped out into the storm. Rain plastered her dark cloak to her skin as she made her way across the courtyard toward the servant quarters. The cobblestones gleamed with reflected firelight from the torches above. Every gust of wind carried whispers of memory, her mother's laugh, her brother's small hand clutching hers, the echo of her own scream the night everything changed. She'd been 13 then, still a child, still believing that monsters were stories whispered by candlelight, until she learned that monsters could kneel, bleed, and obey. Her gift, or curse, had revealed itself in one terrible instant, a scream that stopped a vampire in its tracks. He had looked at her with horror, not hunger. And by morning, her family was gone. Silence had been her only weapon, her only way to disappear. Now, at 20, she had become what she pretended to be, invisible. The servants called her mute Alma. Some pitied her. Others mocked the way she pointed and nodded, the way she flinched when anyone raised their voice. But it was easier that way. Easier than explaining that her voice could command the dead. In 7 years, she had not spoken a single word. As Alma entered the servant hall, the scent of bread and tallow candles filled the air. Dozens of servants huddled near the hearth, whispering about the storm and the king's rare appearance earlier that day. "Did you hear?" one of the maids murmured. "They say the king's been restless. Something's disturbed his sleep. Maybe another rebellion," a man grunted. "Or another mistress," someone snickered. Alma slipped past them quietly, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. She had no interest in gossip. Her only thought was to finish her chores before dawn and crawl into her cot before the nightmares began again. But then the great bronze bell tolled through the corridors, 3 deep, echoing strikes. Every servant froze. The sound meant only one thing: a summons. A woman in a dark gray gown, Madame Wexler, the housekeeper, stormed into the hall, her voice sharp as broken glass. "All servants to the great hall." Immediately, dozens of eyes widened. The great hall was reserved for the nobility, the vampire courtiers who dined beneath its vaulted ceilings. Ordinary servants were rarely, if ever, called there. Alma's stomach turned to ice. Her fingers curled instinctively around the small pendant hidden beneath her collar, a plain piece of silver once belonging to her mother. "Please," she prayed silently, "don't let this be about me." The procession through the castle was eerily quiet. The thunder outside had dulled to a low, rumbling growl. Candlelight flickered along the walls, casting tall, dancing shadows as they entered the great hall. The chamber stretched endlessly, lit by hundreds of candles suspended from wrought iron chandeliers. Banners of black and crimson hung from the rafters. And on the throne of blackened bone and gold sat King Drogo Hugh, the ruler of the Five Kingdoms. The immortal monarch whispered about in every corner of the realm. Alma had seen him only once before, from a distance. But nothing could have prepared her for the living presence of him. He was terrifyingly still. His dark hair fell across his shoulders, framing a face too perfect to belong to the living. His eyes, gray as winter storms, scanned the gathered servants with a gaze that seemed to see through skin, through bone, through silence itself. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and low, carrying effortlessly through the hall. "There have been rumors," he began, "of an intruder in my domain. Someone with unusual abilities. Someone who believes silence can protect them." A murmur rippled through the servants. Alma's breath caught in her throat. Drogo's expression did not change, but his tone darkened, like a storm tightening over the sea. "You think I do not notice the whispers? The missing reports from the villages? The strange power that lingers in my halls like a forgotten song." His gaze swept across the crowd and stopped. Right on her. Alma froze. The air seemed to vanish. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, loud and frantic. She dared not move, dared not breathe. Drogo rose from his throne. Each step he took echoed like a drumbeat. He moved with a predator's grace, slow and certain. Servants parted instinctively before him. He stopped in front of Alma. The candlelight trembled between them. "Look at me, child." The command slid into her mind like silk, irresistible and cold. Her chin lifted against her will. Their eyes met, her wide and terrified, his unreadable, ancient and full of knowing. For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition. "There you are," he said softly. "The little bird who forgot how to sing." He reached out, his gloved hand brushing her chin. His touch was cool as marble. Alma trembled, not from fear alone, but from something deeper, an invisible thread that pulled taut between them. He studied her face as if reading a forgotten script. 7 years, he murmured. "Did you think silence would hide you from me forever?" The hall was utterly still. The other servants stared, confused, afraid to breathe. Alma's lips parted. She wanted to beg, to deny, to run. But she couldn't. And then, Drogo's thumb brushed her lower lip. "Not yet," he whispered. "When you speak again, it will be by your choice, not your fear." He turned to his guards, his voice suddenly commanding. "This one is to be moved to the royal wing. No one speaks to her. No one touches her. She is under my protection from this moment forward." Gasps rippled through the hall. The guards stepped forward, hesitant but obedient. Alma's knees nearly gave way as they guided her toward the exit. Her mind spun. Her secret was broken. The silence she'd worn like armor had shattered in an instant. But before we go further, make sure you subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what happens next might just make you question how far you'd go to survive. Now, let's get back to the story. As the doors closed behind her, she heard the king's final words, spoken so softly she wasn't sure they were meant for her at all. 7 years of silence ends tonight, Alma Stoke. Her real name. Spoken aloud by a vampire king. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "And when it ends," he added, his voice like the promise of a storm, "the world will never be the same." The echo of his words followed her down the torchlit corridor, mingling with the whisper of rain and the ghost of a voice she'd sworn she would never use again. The hall had long emptied, but the storm outside raged on, rattling the stained glass windows like the heartbeat of the restless dead. King Drogo Hugh remained where she had stood, where Alma Stoke had trembled before him. Her name echoed through his mind, a whisper pulled from centuries of silence. Alma, a name he had not heard since the old world burned and the last siren child was lost to history. He turned toward the shadowed throne, his jaw tight. For 700 years, he had ruled this realm. Through wars and treaties, through blood feasts and centuries of unbroken night, he had known control, ruthless, unwavering control. And yet now, that control trembled. Because somewhere in the marrow of his immortal bones, he could feel her voice. Even silent, it resonated, a hum beneath the surface of the world. A note that only he could hear. The girl they called Mute was anything but. He moved through the deserted hall, the echo of his boots following him like a second heartbeat. The scent of rain drifted in through the archways. Beneath it, faint and unmistakable, lingered her scent, crushed lavender and fear. Drogo closed his eyes. He could still see her face, the pale gold of her hair catching candlelight, the tremor in her hands, the silent defiance in her eyes. The same eyes from the legend. The siren child. A human born once in an age, whose voice could weave compulsions strong enough to bind immortals, to unmake kingdoms with a single word. A creature of both mercy and ruin. He had believed the last of them perished centuries ago. Yet here she was. Flesh, blood, trembling, silent. The corners of his mouth lifted, not in cruelty, but in awe. He had waited too long for the world to surprise him again. In the upper corridors of Castle Nightshade, Alma followed in the silent steps of the guards. Her wet cloak clung to her, heavy with rain and fear. The corridors here were nothing like the servant halls. These walls breathed power. Massive iron doors carved with ancient sigils. Windows tall enough to swallow the moonlight whole. They stopped before a door etched with the royal crest, two wolves entwined beneath a single crown. His Majesty's orders, one guard said, his voice low. You will stay here until further notice. Alma nodded faintly. She didn't trust herself to look up. When the doors shut behind her, the silence felt suffocating. The chamber was larger than the entire servant quarters she'd lived in for 7 years. A grand hearth glowed with embers, bathing the room in gold. Velvet curtains framed the windows. A massive canopy bed stood at the center, its linens dark as wine. A gilded cage. Alma pressed her palm against the wall, steadying her breath. What did he want with her? How had he known her name, her real name, after all these years? She wanted to run. To vanish into the forests beyond the castle walls, where even vampires feared to tread. But her legs felt rooted, as though the floor itself was holding her captive. Somewhere beneath her fear, another feeling flickered. Recognition. She had seen the king before years ago, when she was still a child, hidden behind her mother's skirts in the village square. He had passed through once, cloaked in shadow and silence, his presence so immense that the air had seemed to bow around him. She hadn't known then what he was. Only that his voice had made the world still. Now, that same stillness filled her bones. Down in the council chamber, Drogo stood before the map of his realm. His advisors, vampires older than mortal kingdoms, spoke in cautious tones. My lord, said Beric, his general, you've taken a servant girl into your private wing. The court is unsettled. Drogo didn't answer. His gray eyes traced the rivers and borders of his lands absently. She's not just a servant, he murmured at last. She's something older. Something dangerous. Varric frowned. A witch. No, Drogo said softly. A siren. The word silenced the chamber. Impossible, hissed another advisor. Their kind was wiped out before the Northern Wars. So I believed, Drogo said, voice low. Until tonight. He turned from the map, his gaze distant. I could feel her power dormant, but there. Every breath she took vibrated through the walls of this castle. Every heartbeat called to me. Then she must be destroyed, Varric said sharply. If she can command our kind. Drogo's head snapped toward him, eyes flashing silver. Say that again. The general faltered. Drogo stepped forward, his presence filling the room like a storm. You forget yourself, Varric. I decide who dies in this castle, not you. The older vampire bowed his head, trembling. Drogo's voice dropped to a whisper. You speak of destroying what you do not understand. But I have waited centuries to meet another who could unmake me. He turned and strode toward the door, his cloak flaring behind him. I will not destroy her, he said. I will listen. The chamber door creaked open hours later. Alma sat by the hearth, staring into the flames. When the shadow of the king stretched across the floor, she stiffened. Drogo stepped inside, every movement deliberate, controlled. He stopped several paces away, studying her in silence. She did not bow, could not. You've been quiet all your life, he said softly. But not by choice. Alma lowered her eyes. He took another step closer. Do you know what I am? She nodded once. Everyone knew. The King of Nightshade, the oldest of the immortals, the one whose reign began before human history was written. Drogo smiled faintly. Then you know lying to me is pointless. He circled her slowly, a predator assessing a threat that fascinated him. 7 years, you hid here, among my servants. 7 years pretending to be broken. His voice softened to a near whisper. But your silence sings to me. Alma's breath hitched. She wanted to shrink back, but her body refused to move. Drogo stopped behind her, his presence so close she could feel the chill radiating from him. When I was a young king, he murmured, there was a legend of a girl whose voice could command the night itself. She sang once, and 1,000 vampires knelt. He stepped in front of her, lowering himself slightly so their eyes met. Tell me, Alma Stoke, what happens if you speak? Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her throat ached with the ghost of a scream she'd buried years ago. Drogo tilted his head, gray eyes searching her face for something only he could see. You don't trust me yet. Good. You shouldn't. He straightened, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. Fear keeps you alive. But curiosity, that's what binds you to me. He turned toward the fire, his silhouette outlined in molten gold. I ruled this world through blood and silence. But once, long ago, I heard a voice that could undo everything I am. It was the most beautiful sound I have ever known. His eyes shifted to her again, and for the first time, something human flickered there. Regret. Longing. Recognition. He took one slow step closer. Do you know what it is to crave a sound, Alma? To remember it for centuries? She swallowed hard. Drogo reached out not to touch her, but to lift her chin with the air between them, a whisper of compulsion. His voice dropped to a breath. I've waited centuries, he said, to hear that voice again. The fire cracked. The wind moaned through the windows. Alma sat frozen, caught between fear and fascination. Because deep within her, beneath 7 years of silence and scars, a forgotten note stirred. And for the first time since the night she lost everything, Alma Stoke wanted to speak. When the king's decree fell, the hall trembled with whispers. By dawn, Alma was no longer a servant of the lower wing. 2 guards led her through marble corridors she had never dared to tread, past candlelit murals, whispering portraits, and ceilings painted with stars. They brought her to the Eastern Tower, the king's private wing. The doors opened with a hiss, revealing chambers so opulent they hurt to look at. Velvet curtains framed tall, arched windows. A chandelier hung like a frozen constellation. Golden silk sheets rippled across a vast bed. Every inch of it glowed with warmth, and yet Alma felt the chill of a cage. She stood in silence as a maid arranged her belongings, a single threadbare dress, a locket, and a journal whose pages had long run out of words. The girl didn't meet her eyes. None of them did. By sunset, the whispers had already spread. The king has chosen the mute one. She's his new pet. He drinks from silence now. Alma heard them in the rustle of skirts, in the scrape of boots outside her door. Each word was a blade. She tried not to look out the window, but the view pulled her, the courtyard below, where servants hurried under the watch of silver-armored guards. Beyond it, the endless mist of the Blackwood. Somewhere in that mist, her family's ashes slept. That night, she dreamed of them again. She saw her mother's hair, pale as frost. Her father's hands, stained with ink from the letters he never finished. She reached for them and woke to the sound of a door creaking open. He had come. King Drogo Hugh moved like shadow wrapped in patience. His cloak dragged faintly over the marble floor, his eyes glinting with a darkness too deep to be mortal. The firelight painted him in bronze and red. "Do you like it?" he asked softly, as though the silence between them were fragile glass. "Your new chamber." She did not nod. She did not bow. She simply stood there, small and still, her hands pressed to the fabric of her dress. Drogo's gaze lingered. "Most would be weeping for joy," he said, almost to himself. "You, however, look ready to run." Alma's pulse betrayed her fast, trembling. He stepped closer. "You think I brought you here for sport?" His tone was neither cruel nor kind. "No, I brought you here because there is something in you that hums against my senses like a lost chord." His words stirred a memory. A sound she could not remember, making the scream that shattered the night her family vanished. She pressed her palms against her throat. Drogo watched her intently. "You're not mute," he murmured. "You're afraid." Her breath hitched. He tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle. "Tell me," he said, "what silences a songbird? Fear or guilt?" Alma turned away, walking to the window. The moonlight kissed her hair. She could feel his eyes tracing the edge of her reflection in the glass. "I've known many who could not speak," he continued quietly, "but only one whose silence sings." She froze. His words weren't flattery. They were recognition. The king moved closer, and the room seemed to fold around them. "Once," he said, "there was a tale of a child who could command my kind with her voice. They called her the Siren Child." His voice dropped lower. "Do you know that story?" Alma's fingers tightened against the window frame. Because she did. It was her story, though no one living should have known it. The memory came unbidden. A field of dying wheat, her scream tearing through the night, the vampire's body freezing mid-attack, her mother's voice crying her name, Alma. And then nothing. Her throat burned with the ghost of sound. Drogo's reflection appeared beside hers in the glass. "You wear your silence like armor," he said. "But every armor has a crack." He reached out, not to touch her, but to trace the air just beside her shoulder, as though testing the warmth that radiated from her skin. The faint hum between them, that electric awareness from the great hall, returned, sharper now. The space trembled with something neither of them could name. Alma took a step back. Drogo let his hand fall. "Do not fear me," he said. "If I had meant to harm you, you would never have seen the dawn." But it wasn't him she feared. It was what he might awaken. When he turned to leave, she almost believed she'd imagined the weight of his gaze. But at the threshold, he stopped. "What are you hiding, little bird?" he asked quietly. The words sliced through the silence. Alma's lips parted. She wanted to answer, to scream, to tell him everything. The ache in her throat flared, a pulse of light behind her ribs. The air quivered as if waiting for her voice. But the memory of blood and fire silenced her once more. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't understand. Drogo's face softened, just slightly. "Someday," he said, "you'll realize silence doesn't save you." Then he was gone. The door closed with a sigh. Alma stood alone amid gold and velvet, trembling. The candle flames bent toward her as though drawn to something invisible. In the glass, her reflection blurred, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw another face staring back, pale, fanged, familiar. The night outside deepened, whispering her name. And in the hollow of her throat, something ancient stirred, like a song remembering itself. If you are enjoying this story, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. And tell me where you are watching from. Back to the story. Rain pressed against the window panes that night, whispering over glass like ghosts tracing their names. Alma sat in the golden chamber, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the flickering fire. Sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the king's shadow framed in the doorway, his eyes burning through silence like truth itself. And beneath that, deeper still, another memory began to stir, one she had buried so far down she'd forgotten the shape of her own scream. She could no longer hold it back. The past came for her like a tide. She was 13 again. The night was red. They had lived at the edge of the old forest, in a cottage that smelled of rosemary and ink. Her father's books filled every shelf. Her mother's songs filled every morning. They were ordinary people until the night the sky broke. It began with the wind. Then the candles blew out. Her mother had whispered, "Stay here, Alma," but she'd already felt it, a chill that sank beneath her skin. Then came the sound, a knock, gentle, almost polite. Her father opened the door, and the world fell apart. The thing that entered wasn't a man, not really. His eyes burned crimson, his smile stretched too wide. Alma had seen wolves before, but this smile was worse. He moved fast. Her mother screamed. A crash, the table shattering, blood on parchment. Alma had frozen until the creature turned on her. Then something inside her broke loose. Her voice, she didn't remember choosing to use it. It came from a place older than her bones. "Stop." The air trembled. The vampire froze mid-step, eyes wide, his body rigid as stone. He tried to move. He couldn't. Her mother gasped. Her father fell to his knees, trembling. But Alma, little Alma, stood there, voice shaking the walls. "Go back," she had whispered, tears cutting through dust and blood. "Go back to the dark." The creature obeyed. He staggered out into the storm, screaming. The door slammed behind him. And then, silence. Her parents stared at her, horror and awe tangled in their eyes. Her mother whispered, "What did you do?" Alma didn't know. She only knew her throat burned, her ears rang, and the world was suddenly too quiet. She'd turned toward her mother, reaching out. And then the lights went out again. This time, it wasn't the wind. The door burst open once more, but it wasn't the same vampire, it was many. Dozens. Shadows with eyes like fire. And at their head, a figure cloaked in darkness. She never saw his face, only the faint glint of a crown. Her mother screamed her name. Her father pulled her behind him. The next moment, nothing. A scream. A blinding white. Then silence. When she woke, the cottage was gone. So was her family. Only Ash remained. And her voice, her curse, had vanished with them. Alma woke with a gasp, her chest heaving. Sweat clung to her skin. The candle beside her had burned down to a stub. The room was too quiet. But she wasn't alone. A shadow moved near the hearth. Bad dreams said a voice is smooth, calm, ancient. They leave a scent on the air. Drogo Hugh sat by the fire, his black cloak spilling like liquid night across the floor. His gaze was unreadable, his posture regal even in stillness. "How long have you been here?" she signed with trembling hands. He smiled faintly. "Long enough to know your dreams are older than most men's fears." She swallowed, unsure what he meant, until he said her name. Not the one the servants used. Not girl, not mute, not pet. But the name she had not heard aloud in 7 years. "Alma Stoke," he said quietly. Her breath caught. "I wondered if you would remember it," he added. "I've been searching for you for a very long time." Alma's heartbeat thundered in her chest. "Searching?" Drogo rose slowly, the firelight painting his profile in gold and shadow. "The night your voice broke the silence, I felt it, across miles, across kingdoms. It woke something ancient in me. I followed that sound for decades. I thought it lost when the child disappeared." He looked at her then, truly looked. "But you survived." Her lips trembled. "Why?" she whispered. The single word shattered the stillness. It was soft, breathless, yet it rang through the chamber like a bell through fog. Drogo froze. For a moment, neither of them breathed. The fire flickered violently, throwing sparks across the stone. Something in the air shifted, as if her voice had weight, as if the walls themselves were listening. His eyes darkened, not with rage, but wonder. "So it's true," he murmured. "Even a whisper commands the air." Alma pressed a hand to her throat. "Why?" She tried again, trembling. "Why me?" Drogo stepped closer, slow, deliberate, like a priest before an altar. "Because you are not merely human," he said. "You are the voice of the first siren. The gift or curse that binds my kind to your words." Her knees weakened. "My family, taken," he said gently. "Because of what you are. The one who ordered it sought to end the bloodline." She stared at him, horror and disbelief swirling in her eyes. "Was it you?" Drogo's expression fractured, pain flickering behind the centuries in his face. "No," he whispered. "But it was someone who once stood beside my throne." Her pulse roared in her ears. "Then why bring me here?" "Because," he said, "I would rather understand what I once helped destroy." He moved closer until she could see the faintest crack in his composure, the echo of a man beneath the monster. "I will not harm you, Alma," he said softly. "I only ask you to remember." Her throat ached with unshed words. But when she looked at him, this immortal king who had ruled in silence for centuries, she saw something she had not expected. Loneliness. Like hers. The room seemed to breathe around them. The rain softened. The world shrank to the space between their heartbeats. And then, without meaning to, Alma spoke again. Just one word. "Why?" Again, the echo. Again, that shimmer in the air, the soundless tremor of compulsion and grief entwined. Drogo closed his eyes, bowing his head slightly, as if receiving a blessing. "Because," he whispered, "I've waited centuries to hear that voice again." The fire crackled. The night exhaled. And Alma realized, with a chill that ran to her bones, that this king, this creature of night, might be the only one who truly knew what she was. The silence that followed her second word hung in the air like a living thing. Drogo stood near the hearth, his back to the fire, shadows flickering along the hard lines of his jaw. He looked almost human in that moment, almost. But there was something beneath his stillness, something trembling, dangerous, hungry. Alma sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers pressed to her lips. Her throat still burned from the effort of speaking. After 7 years of silence, 2 words had escaped her, and both of them had changed something she couldn't name. He had said he'd waited centuries to hear her voice. Now she understood why. The air between them pulsed with invisible energy, faint but undeniable. When she'd whispered, the fire had bowed toward her, the light trembling as if drawn to her sound. Drogo had gone still, utterly still, the way predators do when instinct wars with reason. She couldn't tell if he wanted to protect her or devour her. For the next few days, he kept his distance. The guards stationed outside her door bowed when he passed. The servants entered only to deliver food, their eyes downcast, their steps quick. Word had spread through Castle Nightshade like wildfire. The silent girl had spoken. They called her the king's siren now, though no one dared use the name within earshot of Drogo himself. Alma moved through her gilded prison like a ghost, touching nothing, saying nothing. Every corner of her chamber gleamed with wealth, velvet curtains, carved obsidian mirrors, tapestries woven with silver thread. But she felt no freer here than in the servants' dormitory. Each night, she waited for him. And each night he came. He arrived quietly, without announcement, as though slipping between the folds of the world. Sometimes he stood at the window, watching the storm. Sometimes he sat by the fire, hands clasped loosely, speaking in that low, deliberate voice that could calm or command. He never asked her to speak again. Instead, he asked questions, gentle ones, designed to coax rather than demand. "Do you dream often? Do you still hear them, your family, in the quiet? Do you know what your silence cost you?" She answered in gestures, in the subtle language of her hands. Occasionally, she wrote in charcoal on parchment brief phrases. Sometimes I still see their faces. Sometimes I wish I had never screamed. He read each word as though it were sacred. And sometimes, when she caught him looking at her, she saw something in his eyes that didn't belong to a king or a monster. Something almost tender. One evening, the castle lay drenched in moonlight. The torches in the corridor burned low, and the hush of midnight filled the air like breath held too long. Drogo entered silently as always, but tonight there was something different in his step, something restless. He moved to the balcony, gazing out across the endless dark forest. "Do you know what it's like," he said, "to live so long that silence becomes your only companion?" Alma watched him. Every sound fades, he continued. The laughter, the prayers, the screams, they all dissolve into dust. But your voice, he turned, his gaze pinning her where she stood. That night, when I first felt it, it was like hearing the sun rise after centuries of winter. Alma's chest tightened. She shook her head, signing rapidly. "You're mistaken. My voice is not a gift." He stepped closer. "Then what is it?" "A curse." He stopped before her, close enough for her to feel the faint chill of his breath. "A curse does not make kings kneel," he murmured. "It does not make the air tremble. Your silence was mercy, Alma. But your voice is truth." She took a step back, shaking. He didn't follow, but his gaze never left her face. "Do you know what I felt when you spoke?" he asked quietly. "Not pain, not power." His voice lowered, roughened. "I felt alive." Alma's throat tightened. She tried to look away, but his voice held her still. There was a strange gravity in him, something magnetic, dangerous, irresistible. "Say something again," he said softly. Her heart lurched. "No, just one word." She shook her head, backing toward the window. His expression hardened, not cruel, but desperate, as if he fought something inside himself. "You hide behind silence as if it can save you. But you don't understand, little bird. You're not the only one who's been waiting." He took another step. "Say my name," he whispered. Alma froze. The words struck through her like lightning. He moved closer, close enough that the faint gleam of his eyes caught hers. "Say it," he murmured again. "Let me hear it." Her pulse thundered in her ears. Every instinct screamed, "Don't." She'd sworn never to use her voice again. She'd seen what it could do. But there was something in his tone, a plea wrapped in command, that unraveled her resolve. Her lips parted. The sound came soft as a sigh. Drogo. The name floated between them, fragile and beautiful. But it wasn't just a sound, it was a key turning in a lock. The fire flared, the curtains shifted though no wind blew. Drogo shuddered, his eyes darkening to storm gray. The name seemed to pierce through centuries of composure, tearing something open inside him. He inhaled sharply, like a man who hadn't breathed in ages. "Again," he whispered, voice rough. She shook her head, terrified of what she'd done. "No." He closed his eyes, struggling against the pull, and for the first time, Alma saw it, the monster and the man, warring beneath the surface of his immortal calm. When he looked at her again, his expression had changed. The hunger was still there, but softened now by something deeper, something human. He reached out as though to touch her, then stopped inches away. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what your voice does to me." Neither moved. The fire hissed, the moon dipped behind clouds. Her breath came quick and shallow. His lingered in sync with hers, each inhale pulling them closer, bound by something older than fear. And then, slowly, Drogo stepped back, breaking whatever spell had formed between them. His tone returned to that calm, regal cadence. "Rest, Alma. Tomorrow, we will speak of what comes next." He turned toward the door, but paused. "Without looking back," he said, "when you spoke my name, the wards around this castle shifted. The old magic stirs again. The others will feel it." Her heart stuttered. "Others?" He looked over his shoulder, eyes burning with a quiet warning. Every vampire in this realm, he said. They'll know the siren lives. Then he was gone, leaving the scent of rain and old blood behind him. Alma sank to her knees, trembling, one hand over her throat. She could still feel his name lingering in her mouth like the taste of fire. And deep within the castle walls, something ancient began to wake. The storm began before dawn. Lightning coiled around the turrets of Castle Nightshade like living serpents, striking the iron spires until the stones trembled. The sky bled gray, the air thick with the smell of ozone and rain. Servants huddled behind locked doors, whispering prayers to gods who'd long abandoned this place. Alma didn't sleep. She sat at her window, her palms pressed against the cold glass, eyes fixed on the restless forest beyond. The storm hadn't woken her, her voice had. Hours ago, when she'd whispered his name, she'd felt something inside her break open. Now, the air itself seemed to hum an answer. The castle groaned as though alive, the torches flaring and dying one by one. From deep below, the old wards carved into stone walls flickered faintly, sigils that had slept for centuries now pulsing with faint, furious light. Drogo had said her voice would wake the others. She hadn't believed him, until she heard it. A sound, distant but unmistakable, the cry of something not quite human. The first to feel it was Ira, the blood seer. Far below the throne hall, her eyes snapped open in her chamber of mirrors. Her reflection multiplied into 1,000 faces, each whispering the same word, siren. The goblet of blood she held cracked in her hand, crimson spilling over the marble. She lives, Ira hissed, the corners of her mouth curving into a smile that had no joy. And he's found her. She rose, the long trail of her black gown whispering across the floor like smoke. In the upper halls, Drogo felt it too. He stood at the edge of his private balcony, cloak whipping in the wind. His jaw was tight, eyes dark as the storm below. The pulse of magic from Alma's chamber beat against his senses, steady, alive, intoxicating. He'd spent centuries chasing echoes of that power, the voice that once sang his kind into silence. Now it was here again, in the body of a trembling girl who dared to speak his name. He closed his eyes. He could still hear the sound of her whisper, soft, human, and yet powerful enough to bend the wards of his ancestral keep. He should have been afraid. Instead, he was hungry. A sharp knock broke the moment. The doors swung open before he could answer. Cashin, his most loyal general, strode in, armor dark with rain, face drawn tight. "My king," Cashin said, bowing low. "The southern wards are flickering. The Bloodseer has sent word. She claims the old bloodline has awakened." Drogo turned slowly. "She is not wrong." Cashin hesitated. "Then it's true? The siren exists?" Drogo's silence was answer enough. The general's eyes flicked upward, unease creeping into his voice. "Forgive me, my lord, but that power nearly destroyed us once. If she speaks again..." Drogo's gaze cut through him like a blade. "If she speaks again, it will be because I allow it." Cashin bowed his head. "Yes, my king. Keep the others away from her. The seer will try to reach her." "She must not." Cashin hesitated. "And if she already has?" Drogo's jaw flexed. "Then she'll remember why she fears me." Meanwhile, Alma's chamber burned with unseen light. She could feel the storm outside, but it was the one inside her that terrified her more. The pulse of the world beat in time with her heart, every thunderclap echoing through her bones. When she touched her throat, warmth spilled beneath her fingers, like her voice was still alive, waiting. She wanted to scream, but fear held her tongue. Then the door opened. "Little bird." Drogo stood framed in the doorway, his black cloak slick with rain, eyes burning with something fierce and unearthly. Alma backed away. "What's happening?" "The storm," he said quietly, stepping closer. "It's not weather, it's reaction. Your voice woke the old magic. You stirred the bloodlines that sleep beneath this soil." Her lips parted. "I didn't mean to. I know. He stopped before her, close enough for the air between them to spark faintly. But now that it's done, the others will come for you. They'll want what you carry. What do I carry? Drogo's expression hardened. A song the world forgot how to survive. The thunder deepened, rolling through the walls like drums. Suddenly, every candle in the room went out. Alma gasped, spinning toward the sound behind her. The mirror in the corner rippled like water, and a figure stepped through, Ira, pale as bone, her eyes black as spilled ink. "Your Majesty," the seer said sweetly, her voice like silk wrapped around a knife. "You should have told me the legend was true." Drogo's expression didn't change, but the air grew colder. "Leave, Ira." She smiled. "I came only to listen." Her gaze drifted toward Alma, studying her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "So this is the child who sings to kings. She doesn't look like much." Alma froze. She didn't understand how the woman had entered or what she wanted, but the way she was being looked at made her skin crawl. Drogo stepped between them. "You will not speak to her." Ira tilted her head unfazed. "And yet you let her speak to you. Dangerous, my king. Have you forgotten what her kind did to us?" His voice dropped, low and lethal. "Go. Now." The torches flared to life again, searing bright white. Shadows flooded the room. For the first time, the seer's mask slipped, her eyes narrowing, her lips curling. "Careful, Drogo. You can chain a siren's body, but not her voice. When she sings again, even you won't be able to silence her." Her body dissolved into smoke, leaving behind the faint scent of iron and roses. When she was gone, Drogo turned to Alma. "You must never let her near you again," he said. Alma's voice shook. "Why? Who is she?" "She is what happens when immortality forgets mercy." His tone softened. "She wants your voice to end me and to free herself from my rule." Alma stared at him. "And what do you want from me?" His eyes lifted to hers, dark, fathomless. "To protect you from what your power will call." "You're afraid," she whispered. For a heartbeat, the king said nothing. Then, very softly, he smiled. "I'm afraid of nothing. But I have waited too long to lose what I've found again." She didn't know whether to run or to reach for him. Outside, the storm broke open, rain slashing across the stone like claws. Inside, the castle shook with the awakening of old forces, blood, song, and power. Drogo turned toward the window, his silhouette cut against lightning. "It begins," he murmured. "What begins?" Alma whispered. He looked back at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, his gaze wasn't cold. It was burning with something that looked almost like fear. "The return," he said, "of everything we buried. Perfect. We'll continue seamlessly from that haunting moment into the prophecy, the oath, and the beginning of trust between them." Here's the next part of the saga. The morning after the storm, Castle Nightshade was silent. The kind of silence that felt listening. Every corridor seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind dared not touch the stone. The servants moved quietly, whispering rumors that traveled faster than footsteps about the king's ward, the storm that obeyed her, the woman who'd walked through mirrors and vanished again. And in the highest tower of the East Wing, Alma Stoke awoke to find her voice had changed the world. She opened her eyes slowly. The fire in her chamber had died to embers, and sunlight, pale and cold, streamed through gauzy curtains. Her throat still ached. When she tried to speak, only a rasp escaped. Drogo had been right, her power came at a cost. She sat up, every muscle trembling, and saw the parchment left at her bedside. A note, written in the king's hand. "Do not be afraid of what you are. Fear only what would claim it. D.H." The letters were dark, carved deep into the page as if written not with ink, but with intention. She held the paper close, then pressed it to her heart. Down in the throne hall, Drogo stood alone. The banners of Nightshade hung heavy in the air, their colors dimmed by centuries of dust and blood. In the center of the marble floor, an ancient sigil, his family's crest, glowed faintly, responding to the pulse of his power. Cassian stood at his side, but the king's mind was elsewhere, centuries back, to the first time he'd heard that voice. A girl in white, barefoot, standing before a court of monsters. Her song had stripped away centuries of bloodlust, forcing every vampire in his dominion to their knees, including him. He'd called her the Siren Child, though no one knew her real name. And when she'd vanished, the balance of the immortal world had fractured. He'd searched for her ever since. And now, after so long, fate had brought him her echo, Alma. He could feel her presence even now, a quiet pulse at the edge of his senses. Cassian spoke carefully. The court grows restless, my lord. The seer whispers that the girl is a curse. Drogo's gaze cut like steel. The seer has forgotten her place. She says the prophecy is near its end. Then she should be afraid, Drogo said softly, because the end will not favor her. That evening, he went to Alma. The halls seemed to breathe around him as he walked, the shadows folding closer in reverence or fear. When he reached her door, he didn't knock. She looked up from where she sat by the fire. The color had returned to her face, though her eyes still carried the shimmer of stormlight. You should rest, he said. I can't, she murmured. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it. Hear what? The voices, she said faintly, whispering my name. Some begging, others calling. She shuddered. It's like they're inside my blood. Drogo stepped closer. They are. Your voice woke the bound. Those who've slept under oath, waiting for the return of their singer. Her brows furrowed. Singer. He paused. There is something you must know. If you want to know what happened next, stay put and don't forget to subscribe and comment your country or city below. This is where it gets better. He led her through a hidden corridor, torches lighting themselves as they passed. The passage descended deeper than she'd thought the castle went, until the air grew cool, heavy with the scent of stone and age. At last, they entered a cavernous chamber. In its center stood a great obsidian altar, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly when she approached. What is this place? Alma whispered. The Hall of Vows, Drogo said, where every ruler of my bloodline has sealed their oaths in blood. She hesitated. Why bring me here? He turned to face her fully, the torches catching the red gleam in his eyes. Because I must make one myself. He drew a dagger from his belt, the blade black as shadow, the hilt adorned with a single ruby. Alma stepped back. What are you doing? Drogo's voice was steady. A blood oath cannot be broken, not even by death. I swear upon it now to protect you, Alma Stoke, against all who would harm or use your voice. He pressed the dagger to his palm and dragged it across the skin. Dark blood welled instantly, thick and ancient, falling onto the stone like molten fire. The symbols on the floor flared red. Alma's heart pounded. Why would you do that? You don't even know if I can control it. Drogo lifted his gaze to hers. Because I've seen what happens when your kind is left unguarded. He extended his hand to her. Take it. She stared, trembling. If I do, what happens? Our fates bind, he said. You'll feel what I feel. Pain, fear, power. It is not an easy bond, but it is a true one. Alma hesitated. Every instinct told her to run. But behind that fear was something else, trust. The kind that came not from comfort, but recognition. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand in his. Their blood touched. The air ignited. Light erupted around them, the symbols blazing gold. The ground trembled as centuries of magic responded to the oath. Alma gasped, feeling warmth rush through her chest, not pain, but connection. Drogo's voice was calm, resonant, eternal. By blood and darkness, by moon and song, I vow this. No blade nor fire, no shadow nor time, shall break this bond until both our hearts cease to beat. The words echoed through the chamber. The light dimmed, leaving only the glow of their joined hands. When the magic faded, Alma stumbled slightly. Drogo caught her, steadying her against his chest. You're bound now, he murmured. No one can take you from this castle, not even fate. Her voice trembled. And if I speak again? His lips curved faintly. Then we'll see whether your voice commands me or saves me. For days after, the bond changed them. Alma felt his presence like a heartbeat beneath her own, a pulse that steadied her when fear tried to rise. She could sense his thoughts sometimes, not as words, but as feelings, cold calm, buried sorrow, centuries of solitude. And in return, Drogo felt something he had not known in an age: warmth. When she walked into a room, the walls seemed lighter. When she touched the air, it breathed again. For the first time, the vampire king who had ruled in silence found himself wanting to listen. But the world outside Nightshade was already moving. Far beyond the forest, messengers rode beneath crimson banners. Rivals whispered of the king's pet, the girl whose song could break empires. And deep within the mirror halls, the seer watched through her glass, her eyes cold and triumphant. She took his hand, she whispered. Good. Let her taste what power does to mercy. Her reflection smiled back at her, a dozen faces in the dark. Now, Ira murmured, let the hunters come. The first thing Alma felt was stillness. It wasn't death, not exactly. It was the pause between heartbeats, the breath the world takes before it begins again. Her body floated in that silence, neither warm nor cold, as if suspended in moonlight. Then she heard it, faint and far, the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Steady, ancient, waiting. When she opened her eyes, the world had changed. The great hall lay in ruins. The banners of Nightshade hung in tatters, and the marble floor was veined with cracks where her voice had struck. Fires burned low in the sconces, their light ghostly and blue. Drogo knelt beside her, his body still streaked with blood and ash. His eyes, silver as stormlight, searched her face like a man seeing the dawn for the first time. Alma, he whispered. She tried to speak. No sound came. Only a pulse of light rippled through the air, soft as a sigh. You're alive, he breathed. Relief broke his composure, a tremor passing through him. I thought. His voice faltered. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, and his hand lingered at her throat. The skin there shimmered faintly, etched with a sigil that hadn't been there before, a mark of both blood and song. What happened to me? She asked at last, her voice a whisper of melody. It wasn't a question so much as a note that carried meaning. Drogo's gaze darkened. You changed, he said. My blood saved you, but it also joined with your gift. You're not human anymore. Not vampire either. He touched her wrist. Her veins glowed faintly beneath her skin, silver threads winding through red. You're something new. Something the old songs warned us about and longed for. She sat up slowly, looking around. The surviving vampires, those who hadn't fled or turned to dust, had gathered in the shadows. Dozens of them, bloodied, trembling, staring at her with reverence and fear. Why are they kneeling? She asked softly. Because they hear you, Drogo said. He rose, his cloak unfurling like dark wings. Your voice doesn't command them anymore, Alma. It awakens them. Every vampire here feels it, the pull of something older than hunger. They will follow you now. Her chest tightened. I never wanted to rule anyone. He smiled faintly. Then perhaps you'll do what I never could, teach them freedom. Outside, the siege fires were dying. The night was eerily calm. The Blackwood stretched before them, vast and quiet, its mist carrying the scent of rain. Alma walked among the wounded, human and vampire alike, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. Wherever she passed, whispers followed. Some reached for her hands. Others bowed their heads. Her voice had killed. But now, when she spoke, it soothed. The air shimmered with each word, mending what could still be saved. Drogo watched her from the steps of the ruined throne, awe and sorrow warring in his gaze. You've changed everything, he said quietly when she returned to him. No, she replied, her tone gentle but unyielding. We have. They stood together where the ceiling had fallen open, revealing the bleeding sky. Dawn had come thin and uncertain, but dawn nonetheless. For the first time in centuries, sunlight touched the stones of Nightshade. It did not burn Drogo. Instead, it painted him in pale gold, as if forgiving him for the darkness he had carried. He turned his face toward it, disbelief softening his features. "It shouldn't be possible," he murmured. Alma smiled faintly. Maybe the world decided to start over, too. When the last of the wounded were tended, the vampires gathered before the throne. Drogo looked out over them, his warriors, his council, his kin, and then at her. "This is your moment," he said. She shook her head. "It's ours." He stepped aside. Alma ascended the dais. The light caught her hair, turning it the color of snowlit gold. Her eyes glowed faintly, no longer mortal, no longer bound. She raised her hand, and the murmuring ceased. "No one commands another ever again," she said. Her voice rang clear through the hall, calm, resolute, carrying power that was no longer destructive but harmonious. The vampires bowed, not from compulsion but choice. And for the first time in history, the silence that followed was not fear, it was peace. Later, when the castle grew quiet again, Drogo found her where she had always belonged, by the window overlooking the Blackwood. The forest seemed alive now, green and silver under the moon's touch. He stood beside her, his presence steady and solemn. "You've done what I could not," he said softly. "You've ended the reign of blood." She turned to him, her smile tender. "You gave me the chance to speak again." That was all it ever took. He reached out, fingers brushing her throat, not in ownership, but reverence. "7 years you hid it," he murmured, "and now the world trembles because of it." Alma's eyes met his. "No," she whispered. "The world sings." They stayed that way, framed by moonlight and ruin. The song of the wind through the broken windows sounded almost human, almost like laughter. Some said that in the centuries to come, Nightshade became a sanctuary where humans and vampires lived under one law, the law of the voice. Others swore the king and the siren vanished into legend, their names carried only in lullabies. But if you walk through the Blackwood on a still night, when the mist curls low and the stars tremble, you might hear it. A single voice, soft and eternal, humming to the world she remade. And somewhere in the echo, a second voice answers, low, immortal, unending.